Erik Darling here with Darling Data, and got I don't know, mildly educational video here about some stuff with locking hints in SQL Server queries. This is by no means a deep dive into every single locking hint. Most of them are fairly easy to figure out, but I do want to show you some misconceptions about locking hints, and then some useful locking hints, situationally useful locking hints, and then some potential gotchas with a couple other locking hints. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about here. I probably should have progressed that slide before I started yakking about locking hints. But anyway, before we get into all that nonsense, let's talk a little bit about the health and wellness and the performance of this channel. If you would like to support my efforts to bring you these interesting educational SQL Server videos, you can sign up for a membership right about here in the video description for as few as $4 a month, pre-tax. Before it comes to me, it does get taxed. YouTube does take 30% out of that. So I'm looking at basically like 3 $1 scratch tickets and a Lucy from the bodega for every paying member. If you can do that, great. If you have already blown your financial load this month on scratch tickets and Lucy's at the bodega, well, you're a person after my own heart. And you would have to do something a bit less expensive in order to show your undying loyalty to being a data darling. You can like, you can comment, you can subscribe. And if you would like to ask a question on my office hours episodes, where I take a question, excuse me, that you ask semi-privately and I answer it very publicly, this link is also available down in the video description as well. And you can submit a question and I will answer it, assuming that it is legible and vaguely understandable. If you need help that goes beyond just asking strangers random questions on the internet, I am of course available to do consulting for SQL Server. All sorts of good stuff. Health checks, performance analysis, hands-on tuning, responding to performance emergencies, and of course making sure your developers smarten up and start not causing performance emergencies. So all of that stuff is available from this beautiful face. If you would like some recorded versions of this beautiful face teaching you about SQL Server, you can get all 25 hours of my performance tuning content for about $150 US, and that will last you the rest of your life. Good for you there. Upcoming events, we are still looking forward to SQL Saturday, New York City, launching May the 10th, taking place in Times Square. Beautiful, crime-free, clean, friendly Times Square, where you can come and you can go to the Microsoft offices there, and you can learn all about all sorts of data stuff. So that's a happy time for everyone. You even get lunch. I'm served by me, not made by me, but I'll hand you a bag. Maybe I'll just let you take a bag. If you're really nice, I'll let you take 2. But you got to be nice. Anyway, let's talk about some locking hint stuff, because it is fun and interesting. Now, what I want to show you here is that even with a good index in place, and even doing something like this, where we are limiting the number of rows that come out of, that we are like planning to modify, the row lock hint for SQL Server is merely a suggestion. All right, so if we do this and we run the code in here, SQL Server does not, SQL Server does maybe start taking row locks, but it does escalate those row locks up to an object level lock. If we were to change this to a much higher number, like 90,000, and we were to rerun this, SQL Server, you'll see that, in this case, SQL Server does actually take key locks, right? We do that stuff in here, right? So here's all our key locks, and well, I mean, there are some some page locks as well, but all of the X locks, right? We have IX locks on pages and objects and stuff. Those aren't like the real exclusive locks, but the X locks for these, we do have those actually happening here, right? So for the actual X locks, those are only taken at the row level, but for everything else, we have just intent exclusive. But when we had when we had to sift through more stuff in that top 5,000 query, when we had that set to 30,000, SQL Server was like, well, that's a lot of key locks, or that's a lot of row locks. We're escalating that to a table level lock, right? Remember that locks go from row to object or page to object. They do not go from row to page to object. So even the row lock hint can be ignored by SQL Server. Where I end up, where I see people forgetting that they need lock hints is covered in another great post by my dear friend and Canadian Michael J. Swart. I look forward to you joining me as an American in the 51st state, my friend. See you soon. So we'll have passport-free friendship. I do see people messing this up a lot. So when you use merge, and that merge has multiple actions, right? Most commonly update, insert, right? If you just have a single action merge, I mean, granted, there are like some interesting use cases for doing that with inserts, but usually like a combo merge thing, you do need to either set the transaction isolation level for that merge statement to serializable, or hint the serializable isolation level with the table you're merging into. Okay, so important stuff there. A place where I love using locking hints is in places where people did not know that they were subject to potential race conditions in their code. I've talked about this a bunch in some of recent videos, so I'm not going to spend too long on it here because we have some other stuff to cover. But if you are doing anything that could be negatively affected by concurrency, either while your query is running, remember read committed, not a very strict isolation level, allows all sorts of other stuff, is not a snapshot of your data, and you need to make sure that you are actually getting the current top thing to do something with, like this, then you need to make sure that nothing else can mess with your data while you are in the process of finding that data, right? So you need locking hints to prevent race conditions, even under read committed, the default pessimistic isolation level. Race conditions are not alone with in optimistic isolation level land. They can happen to you anytime, anywhere. Another place where I end up using locking hints a lot is when I am putting data into temp tables. Now, table variables, without doing some real crazy tricks, you can't get a parallel insert into them. But when I'm dumping data, especially a fairly large amount of data into a temp table, well, I usually want to make sure that I get a fully parallel insert while that's happening. There are some things that will prevent that. For example, if you have a clustered index on the table, if you have a, clustered primary key, but really any non-clustered index, right? Or if you have an identity column on your table, you will mess up SQL Server's ability to do a fully parallel insert. It's worth noting that if you need something to behave like an identity column in your temp table, just replace you can just remove the identity attribute from whatever column that is and just use row number in your select list to generate that auto-incrementing number. Row number does not have this limitation, so you can get around a lot of problems with that. So it's any of this stuff. Of course, any non-clustered index, like I said, that'll also mess you up. But we'll get to that in a minute. So let's run this query. And there is not a tremendously big performance difference for what I'm doing here, but the execution plan is a good enough example, and there is some benefit that you can see from these. So in this query plan, note that we do have a parallel scan of the clustered index, right? We have a little parallelism operator here, but then we gather streams almost immediately afterwards. And the insert into the temp table is done outside of the parallel zone, right? This marks the end of the parallel zone right here. And this happens single threaded. This all takes 1.4 seconds. We can see that right there. Now, we can get around that by adding a tab lock hint to the insert. So again, no clustered index, no identity column, no primary key, no non-clustered indexes. It's got to be a heap for this. If we run this, we will get a fully parallel insert, and this will shave a bit of time off that. Notice now the gather streams operator is over here. The insert is before that, and it has our little racing stripes on it. And rather than taking like a second and a half, it takes about 800 milliseconds. So this is not for a ton of rows. Obviously, the more rows you get involved with here, the better this is as a hint to include in your queries. You can get very, very similar behavior by doing select into. Right, so we're gonna have our little select into magic here, and we will see just about the same execution metrics on this one. Still 800 milliseconds with the table insert within the parallel zone. There's our little parallel racing stripes, and the parallel zone ends here. So I do get questions sometimes like, hey, is it better to create your temp table or just do select into? And my answer is that it is somewhat situational. I am generally okay with select into, but you should be careful with the way SQL Server interprets expressions with select into. Remember that like the beauty of creating a table is you fully control the data types, the data lengths for strings, the nullability of columns. You get to pick all that stuff when you create the table. You don't really get that with select into if you start like having like case expressions, or you start concatenating strings together, or like adding numbers up, or like doing any math in your select list. There's all sorts of stuff where SQL Server might either implicitly infer or convert your expression to some other data type. So if you are getting weird, inconsistent results with select into in that regard, you may want to think about just creating the table with the types you want. But if you're doing select into and you're getting the parallel insert, and then you do the create table insert and your plan slows down at all, you most likely can get around that just adding a tab lock hint to the insert, so that you get the fully parallel insert, which is commensurate with the behavior when you do select into. And like I like this a lot as a sort of a thing. Now, one thing that I always get questions about, because like a big part of my consultancy is helping people get away from bad habits, and of course NOLOCK is a fairly well-known best habit. And while I'm talking through various ways to get rid of NOLOCK hints, is generally like optimistic isolation levels are a much better idea. People are like, but dirty reads. And I'm like, but wrong, because optimistic isolation levels don't allow dirty reads. NOLOCK and read uncommitted allow dirty reads. Optimistic isolation levels, you can have like stale reads when you are like if you're reading an older version from the version chain than you would expect, right? Because you're not reading potentially the most up-to-date version of the row, but you're not getting dirty reads. But what a lot where the conversation always seems to go is like, well, if I take out the NOLOCK hint, I get blocked. Yes. If I use NOLOCK, I can get a row back. Yes, but what's in that row? And then ultimately, like someone will ask, well, what about READPAST? What does READPAST do? And READPAST is situationally a very cool and interesting hint if you are doing something where you truly don't care about rows that are locked. You're okay with skipping over those. So what I'm going to do here is just run this simple update for one row in the users table, right? So begin tran update increment reputation by 1, where the ID equals 22656. So we run that, and this has an open transaction, and we're off and running. And over in this window, I have 3 queries. I have this top 1 query, right, where I'm saying, give me the top 1 user by reputation descending. This will get blocked, right? Because this thing is open and doing something. This query with no locking hint gets blocked. If I do read past, Well, notice that I get this row back here, right? Before I go on to NOLOCK, I want to show you what happens when I roll this back, right? So I'm going to roll back that transaction. If I run READPAST with this now, I get John Skeet with a reputation of 1,047,863, right? So this is the top reputation in the table. Coming back over here, if I run this update, and I do that with the transaction open and running, READPAST skips over John Skeet, and I actually get the second highest reputation in the table. If you're okay with this, if you're okay with skipping over locked rows and just getting rows that are not locked returned to you, READPAST might be okay. But that may not be a-okay with your users, right? Like that might not be what they're quite after if they're looking for stuff like this. And of course with NOLOCK, well, if we run this now and we look, we do get like John Skeet again, but we get John Skeet with his reputation incremented by 1. Is this a big deal for this? But if you had an optimistic isolation level, what you would get back is his original reputation, which is, of course, make sure that's done, this, right? So is NOLOCK a big deal here? Probably not. Is READPAST a good fit here? Probably not. Is this query getting blocked annoying? Very much so. But you would get around all of any sort of like questionable discrepancy if you were using an optimistic isolation level here. Under both read committed snapshot isolation and snapshot isolation, you would still see John Skeet, and you would still see him with the high reputation that ends in 3 rather than the one that ends with 4, right? So his reputation prior to the update. Is that always going to be correct? Maybe, maybe not. The important thing to understand here is that not every query needs the same locking guarantees and granularity. There may be times when you can get away with NOLOCK. There may be times when you can get away with read committed. There may be times when you can get away with a read past hint. I find that most workloads work best under read committed snapshot isolation with specific queries targeted to use a slightly different isolation level or locking mechanism when they're reading through data. So that part is up to you, right? If your workload is like, if your database is under the default read committed isolation level and the only way for you to get queries to return anything ever is to use no-lock hints, you are much, much better off with an optimistic isolation level than you are continuing with the no-lock hints. So that's about it here. That is the end of the demo file. You can tell there are no more line numbers after this, so we have run out of things to talk about. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in another video another time where we will talk about some more stored procedure stuff. So thank you for watching. Goodbye.